The elevator shuddered without warning, and Martin felt his stomach drop as overhead lights flickered ominously for several seconds, hinting at an impending crisis that neither man could evade. He had never feared enclosed spaces before this moment, yet now he found his pulse hammering like a frantic drum, reminding him that they were confined in a steel box suspended above the busy streets far below. Trapped beside him was James, a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s whose calm expression contrasted sharply with the tense flicker in his eyes. Their predicament began with a routine afternoon, yet it evolved in an instant into something that forced them to acknowledge each other's presence more intimately than they ever expected. Martin and James found themselves in this towering Chicago office building for unrelated reasons, but fate decided to intertwine their paths. Martin, a measured man in his late 40s who worked in project management, had arrived to finalize a contract with an elusive client, never suspecting he might spend the rest of his day trapped between floors. James, meanwhile, had come for a scheduled meeting in the Human Resources Department on the 30th floor, hoping to secure a position that would stabilize a life he had been reconstructing for years. They exchanged polite nods when they stepped into the elevator, unaware that an unseen mechanical failure would soon halt their journey. As soon as the cabin lurched and stopped, harsh buzzing alarms echoed through the narrow space, eventually fading into a tense silence broken only by the faint hum of emergency lights. Each man attempted to remain poised, fiddling with the inoperable emergency phone and pressing unresponsive buttons that produced only flickers of static or softly buzzing tones. The air felt thicker with every passing minute, raising the temperature of the cramped environment and pulling them into an uneasy alliance of necessity. Neither knew how long they would be stuck, but the absence of outside communication made them realize they had only each other for company and consolation. James kept his back against the metallic wall, trying to calm his nerves by closing his eyes and taking measured breaths, while Martin leaned forward with one hand on the panel, whispering reassurances that someone had to be working on a solution. Still, the seconds felt like hours, and a creeping sense of vulnerability filtered into both their minds. They each worried about family obligations, forgotten errands, and the simple fear of being overlooked by the people operating the building. Yet, as the first hour dragged on, conversation became a lifeline, and personal stories began to surface in hopes of distracting themselves from dread. Eventually, they slid down to the elevator floor, sitting close enough that their shoulders brushed and their breaths intermingled in the stale air. Their voices dropped to hushed tones as they spoke about childhood memories, recent heartbreaks, and the unspoken worries that surfaced during such an unexpected crisis. The early tension between two strangers gave way to a quiet bond, nurtured by the shared goal of enduring this ordeal without succumbing to panic or despair. As flickering lights played shadows on their faces, Martin noticed that James looked at him with calm focus, like someone who recognized the potential for comfort even in dire circumstances. Neither man anticipated how much deeper this connection would become in the hours ahead, but for the moment, they clung to gentle conversation and cautious optimism. With each whispered recollection, an undercurrent of warmth trickled through the tension, foreshadowing an intimacy that neither expected. Though Chapter 1 ended in uncertainty, the stage was set for a powerful transformation forged by necessity, proximity, and the gentle pull of two people discovering an unlikely spark in the dark confines of a motionless elevator. As the second hour passed, Martin felt the elevator's stale air pressing against his cheeks, reminding him that each minute in this steel cage weighed heavily on his nerves. Attempts to call for help failed, leaving him and James to share their fears in hushed voices. As James sometimes placed a steady hand on Martin's shoulder to calm the trembling he couldn't quite hide, and Martin clung to that warmth like a lifeline. Under the flickering light, they spoke of past relationships. James had once believed in forever with a partner who passed away too soon, while Martin admitted to a broken engagement that made him doubt any promise of lasting devotion. Each admission dissolved a layer of guardedness, forging a fragile bond neither man had expected when they first stepped into the building. Sitting shoulder to shoulder against the unyielding metal wall, they discovered that honest confessions offered a more tangible kind of relief than any hopeless effort to pry open the sealed doors. Tentative touches replaced nervous distance. A brush of fingertips along an arm, a lingering hand against a chest, a slight shift that brought them closer without words. The steady thud of James's heartbeat under Martin's palm reminded them both that life still pulsed somewhere beyond these cramped borders, promising that hope could exist even in confinement. Every breath seemed shared, each exhale drifting into the other's space, confirming that genuine comfort could take hold where fear had threatened to dominate. As time stretched forward without any sign of rescue, anxiety gave way to a deeper need for closeness that bordered on desperate, yet somehow felt natural under the circumstances. Though each man still dreaded the possibility of indefinite entrapment, the warmth of another heartbeat became the best shield against despair. Together, they braced themselves for the unknown, sustained by the soft glow of human connection that refused to be extinguished, even by the grim hum of a broken elevator stranded between floors. The hours stretched on, and the temperature inside the elevator rose to an almost stifling degree, prompting Martin to peel away his suit jacket and drape it over his knees while he tried to stay composed. He noticed James doing the same, unbuttoning his collar and running a hand through his damp hair with a weary sigh that signaled both discomfort and the lingering anxiety pulsing between them. They could hear faint noises in the building, an occasional clang or muffled thump, which fed their hope that someone might be inching closer to a rescue, but each passing minute without progress wore down their patience. Yet, through all the frustration, a fragile optimism clung to them, magnified by the quiet intimacy they had forged in that cramped space. Hey, thanks for watching until this point. Please leave a comment if you're enjoying the video. It really helps us grow the channel and reach more people. And hey, thank you very much. Let's get back to story. At some point, Martin felt an overwhelming need to release the tension that had built up inside him ever since the first jolt stopped the elevator. Without warning, he let out a shaky laugh at the absurdity of their predicament, which drew a curious glance from James, who managed a wry grin in response. That small spark of humor bridged the gap between them, and when James reached out, curling his hand around Martin's, there was no hesitation, just a mutual understanding that neither man wished to be alone in this ordeal any longer. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, the raw sincerity of their companionship, however unexpected, pressed them closer. A soft, almost tentative kiss came next, initiated by Martin in a moment of vulnerability he couldn't ignore, a gentle brush of lips that allowed him to feel James's reassuring warmth. The tension that had hovered in the air seemed to channel itself into that single action, a cautious gesture that asked as many questions as it answered. James's hand slipped around Martin's waist, drawing them together until no space remained between their bodies, and the closeness felt simultaneously electrifying and soothing. Slow, reverent kisses followed, each one whispering quiet promises of solace that neither man had expected to find in the depths of misfortune. Time blurred, and the line between comfort and need became difficult to define. Martin's fingers drifted over the slight curve of James's shoulder, tracing the shape of muscles that tensed and then relaxed beneath his lingering touch, each stroke conveying a silent affirmation of safety and mutual desire. They pressed their foreheads together, breathing in unison, aware that their tender exchange hovered on the edge of something that could change them beyond this crisis. James murmured that it had been years since he felt so connected to anyone, and Martin, fighting back tears of relief, whispered that he had barely felt secure enough to trust. Yet James's presence gave him courage. Clothes rustled against the metal walls, and heated skin touched skin in small but meaningful ways that spoke of preparation, rather than anything fully realized. They navigated this new territory carefully, exchanging lingering caresses along waists and chests that served as a tentative exploration of boundaries. Each tilt of the head, each trembling hand adjusting a collar or smoothing a patch of sweat-damp hair, carried an unspoken promise of deeper closeness. Neither man verbally acknowledged the shift from casual comfort to conscious attraction, but their shared breath and elevated heartbeats told them exactly what was happening. A gentle surrender to the possibility that they could find unexpected solace even in the darkest moments of uncertainty. Eventually, the elevator rattled with a faint mechanical whir, snapping them back to the present as hope flared in both sets of eyes. They separated just enough to look at one another in alarm and anticipation, feeling their chests tighten at the thought of rescue. Yet the machinery merely hissed, failing to budge, leaving the doors sealed and the men locked together for a bit longer. Martin and James exhaled shaky laughs, still clinging to each other's warmth as they rode out the wave of excitement and disappointment. In that moment, the fear of continued isolation dissolved into a fierce gratitude for the emotional sanctuary they had created together. The elevator stayed in that half-lit limbo, humming with quiet tension that accented the warmth still lingering on Martin's lips, a reminder of the gentle yet powerful kiss he and James had shared only moments before. Both men breathed in short, measured bursts as they acknowledged how much their closeness had intensified since the initial moments of panic, shifting from mere survival to an unspoken promise that pulsed beneath every touch. The metallic walls, once menacing and cold, now felt like the backdrop to a private world where they had found solace. Yet both understood they couldn't remain in this silent capsule forever, no matter how addictive the comfort of each other's presence had become. A low rumble reverberated behind the elevator panel, renewing their sense of hope that someone outside might be working to free them, and James responded by resting his palm against Martin's cheek, as if to steady not only Martin's nerves but his own as well. Their shared anxiety found its voice in whispered reassurances, with Martin admitting he had never allowed himself to let go so fully and James confessing he rarely believed in second chances until this unorthodox situation forced him to lower the guard he had kept for years. They huddled in the faint glow of the emergency light, exchanging tentative smiles that carried relief and a hint of hesitation, because while desperation had sparked their intimacy, they now sensed that genuine emotions were blossoming and would need tender care beyond the confines of this stalled machinery. Eventually, they adjusted their clothes, trying to cool down from the oppressive heat and from the electric charge of their previous moments, offering each other shy looks that suggested a mixture of desire and unease. Martin cleared his throat and muttered that he needed a breath of fresh air more than he ever had before, which made James chuckle softly as he nodded in agreement, leaning back against the wall where he could observe every subtle movement Martin made. The tension between them was no longer solely about being trapped. It had become a swirling blend of curiosity, passion, and uncertainty about whether this bond would persist once the doors opened and the outside world reclaimed them. A sudden crackle from the emergency speaker made them jump, and they rose on unsteady legs, clinging to each other's arms in momentary excitement that soon faded when the sound cut off without any real message or hint of progress. Disheartened yet determined not to lose hope, James slid his fingers between Martin's, finding in that simple entwining of hands the resolve they both needed. He spoke in hushed tones about what might come next, about whether they could meet again beyond this accident of fate, and about how facing real life together might feel if they chose to keep exploring this fragile spark that had ignited so swiftly. Martin squeezed back, murmuring that he didn't have all the answers, but that he wanted to try, even if taking that risk meant confronting all the uncertainties waiting outside these doors. Falling quiet once more, they heard distant clanking that might signal an impending rescue, and a renewed surge of adrenaline shot through their veins, reminding them that the clock was ticking on this strange interlude. They shared a look rich with both anticipation and wistful reluctance, aware that no matter how soon or how late they were saved, the world beyond the elevator would undoubtedly test what they had discovered here. Yet with each warm glance and reassuring squeeze, Martin and James readied themselves for the next step in their unpredictable story, determined to face it together, hand in hand. Rescue efforts echoed in distant clanks and rumbling vibrations that punctuated the stillness, hinting that people outside were testing the mechanisms or searching for a way to bring the stalled car to safety, which in turn heightened Martin and James's awareness that their private interlude would soon end. Both men lingered near the center of the elevator, hesitating to stray too far apart, as though the bond forged between them might weaken if they stopped maintaining that gentle contact through interlocked fingers or a shared brush of the elbow. Thoughts of what might transpire once they were free hovered like specters in the corners of their minds, and every shared glance carried subtle questions. Would the tenderness they had discovered here survive the sudden return to normalcy, or would it dissipate under the bright lights of the outside world? Their closeness had grown to include soft caresses along each other's arms and shoulders, accompanied by murmured reassurances that the outside chaos could wait. James pressed a tender kiss to Martin's temple, breathing in the scent of his hair, while Martin responded by slipping his hand beneath James's loosened collar to trace slow, calming circles on the back of his neck. These gestures were not purely lustful but spoke to a deeper longing for companionship and understanding, a quiet reflection of two people who had been starved for genuine closeness but were wary of shattered hopes. The taste of attraction mingled with an unmistakable sense of emotional relief, promising that, regardless of what lay beyond the elevator doors, something meaningful had bloomed within these confining walls. They continued exchanging stories, some personal regrets, a few stray fantasies, and the outlines of uncertain future plans, often pausing to share slow kisses that alternated between gentle exploration and heightened need. Although a flicker of raw desire crossed both their minds, they limited themselves to tender stroking of each other's torsos and the soft press of lips against throats or collarbones, never allowing the surge of passion to overwhelm their fragile calm. The threat of being discovered by rescuers at any random moment lent an edge of excitement, but it also imposed restraint, reminding them that some desires were best indulged away from prying eyes or the unstoppable intrusion of heavy machinery. Each graceful touch carried the promise of more intimate moments when freedom was theirs again, a promise tinted with the thrill of anticipation. Several times, the elevator rattled as tools clanged against metal doors or cables shifted overhead, causing both men to jolt upright, hearts pounding in unison at the prospect of imminent release. They would share a half-smile at their startled reactions, acknowledging that, while they hungered for rescue, they also felt a bittersweet ache at losing this cocoon of time, where a spark of genuine connection had taken root. James, voice trembling slightly, confessed that he feared reality might erode their newfound bond, but Martin gently pressed his hand to James's cheek, assuring him that their meeting felt too important to ignore once they stepped back into the world. Neither man had a flawless plan for making a fledgling relationship thrive, yet they believed, in that moment, that such uncertainty was worth embracing. With the mechanical bangs and scraping sounds outside intensifying, they exchanged one last, slow kiss, leaning forehead to forehead in a silent vow that whatever happened next, they would not let the world turn them into strangers again. The air felt supercharged with a mix of longing, fear, and the exhilarating promise of a shared tomorrow. For Martin and James, that promise represented a choice to trust not only each other but also the possibility of second chances and a love that could be strong enough to endure beyond the confines of this metal box. Hand in hand, they waited, breath caught in their throats, prepared for the final moment when the elevator doors would open and life's many questions would crash over them in a wave of glaring light. After a final series of metallic bangs, the elevator doors groaned and jerked open, flooding the cramped space with blinding light that made Martin and James shield their eyes for several seconds, as the harsh reality of the outside world reclaimed them. A cluster of maintenance workers, security personnel, and paramedics rushed forward, helping each man out of the cabin and asking urgent questions about their physical state. But their hearts pounded more from the emotional intensity of the past hours than from exhaustion or dehydration. Despite the bright chaos and the sudden presence of others, Martin and James managed to exchange a quick, grounding look, silently reminding each other of the tenderness that had grown in the dim glow of that stalled steel box. Paramedics encouraged them to breathe in deep gulps of fresh air and offered bottles of water to combat the stifling heat they had endured for so long. Both men complied, nodding through medical checklists with distracted politeness, their minds already spinning with thoughts about how to translate their private, profound bond into the everyday world. James felt an inexplicable pang of fear that the closeness they had shared might fade under fluorescent lobby lights, so he reached across the gap between them to grasp Martin's forearm, letting him know with that single gesture that he wasn't planning to leave without some promise of a tomorrow together. Once cleared for release, they stepped aside from the growing crowd of onlookers, collecting themselves in a quiet corner of the expansive lobby, where they could finally speak without interruption. Martin, his throat tight with a rush of gratitude and apprehension, held James's gaze as he asked whether this experience could be more than just an extraordinary moment born out of crisis. James, equally uncertain but unwilling to let fate slip through his fingers, gently brushed the back of his hand along Martin's cheek, assuring him that he had no intention of letting a door close on the fragile intimacy they had nurtured in the darkest hours. They exchanged contact information, trembling with a mix of excitement and disbelief that a spark of genuine connection could emerge from what seemed like a nightmare scenario. Conversations about next steps, maybe sharing dinner, catching a movie, or simply meeting for coffee, flowed freely, each idea laced with the hope that their tenderness might blossom into something lasting. As they slipped out of the lobby's revolving doors, stepping onto the bustling city street with sirens wailing in the distance, Martin and James felt the cool evening air fill their lungs, clearing away the final remnants of stale elevator breath and sealing the promise of a new chapter beyond the confines of that stalled machine. Long after the tower faded behind them, both men continued to sense the lingering warmth that had taken root when time stood still, and neither needed to voice the truth they both understood. This unexpected twist had woven them together, revealing that second chances and unforeseen connections can surface where fear and isolation once held firm. In that knowledge, they found hope, letting the city's shimmering lights bear witness to their decision to carry forward the bond they had forged in the heart of an impossible situation. Confident that real life could never extinguish the spark of genuine, hard-won closeness they had discovered far above the ground.